Laughed. The gas station cameras caught everything. Two black women in a white Cadillac, hands forced against the hood of a police cruiser, wrists zip-tied behind their backs while three officers laughed. One of the women was crying. The other was completely still, not from fear but from something colder than fear, something calculated. What the officers didn't know, what nobody standing on that concrete lot in Harwick, Texas knew yet, was that the still one had already made a single phone call that would dismantle their careers, their department, and every lie they'd told themselves about who they were allowed to humiliate. Life. Before we go any further, if you've found this story, do me a stick with it until the very end. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. 5. The drive from Dallas had taken 4 hours longer than it should have, mostly because Simone kept stopping to buy things. A bag of blood oranges at a roadside stand outside Waco. A small jar of Tupelo honey from a woman selling it out of the back of a pickup truck near Corsicana. Handmade get-well card. This gas gift shop that she'd spent 20 minutes selecting because the ones with flowers felt too funeral and the ones with jokes felt too careless. Her sister Diane had called her 3 times during that stretch of highway. You're not even in Harwick yet. I'm getting mama things. She has things. She has a whole house full of things. She doesn't have these things, Simone said, holding the card up against the windshield like Diane could somehow seize it through the phone. Diane let out a long, exhausted sigh, the kind she'd been perfecting since they were teenagers. 5. Just drive, Simone. I'll meet you there in 2 hours. Try not to adopt a dog on the way. Simone had almost done exactly that outside of Hillsboro, but the point was she hadn't. She was still smiling about it when she pulled into the Falcons Reach Travel Center on the edge of Harwick, a town of maybe 12,000 people that sat between 2 stretches of flat farmland like it had been forgotten by everyone who didn't live there. The station was clean enough, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a rack of dusty wind chimes rattling near the entrance to the attached convenience store. Pulled up to pump 7 killed the engine on her sister Diane's Cadillac XT6. She'd borrowed it for the weekend because her own car was in the shop and stepped out into the August heat. It was 6:14 in the evening. The sun was still high and brutal. She was swiping her card at the pump when the cruiser pulled in. She didn't think anything of it. Small-town police presence at a gas station. Nothing unusual. She watched the pump numbers tick upward and scrolled through her phone for a good song to play for the rest of the drive. She was debating between 2 playlists when she heard the crunch of boots on asphalt. She looked up 2 officers, both white, both in Harwick PD uniforms, both standing closer than they needed to be. The one who'd spoken was slightly shorter, with a jaw like a block of wood and sunglasses that had probably cost $80. Plate red, Decker, license and registration, he said. Not a question. Simone kept her expression neutral. Is there a problem? License and registration, he repeated. In cadence, that tone. F. I'm just getting gas, officer. Can you tell me what this is about? We received a report about a vehicle matching this description. He said it's the way people say things they've rehearsed with just enough vagueness to be unprovable. License and registration, ma'am. Last time I'm asking politely. Like an officer. YCE on his nameplate, heavy-set thumbs hooked in his belt, was already walking a slow circle around the Cadillac. He was looking for something. Or pretending to. Simone wasn't the kind of woman who panicked. She'd been a licensed nurse for 11 years, had worked 2 years in an emergency psych ward where she'd talked down people in the middle of some of the worst moments of their lives. She knew how to breathe through a situation. She knew how to not give people a reason to escalate. She got her license out of her purse, found the registration in the glove seconds, while Price stood at her passenger window, watching her do it with the same energy as someone expecting to find a weapon. She handed the documents to Decker. He looked at them for a long time, longer than it should have taken. This your car? Belongs to my sister. I'm borrowing it for the weekend. Where's your sister? She's meeting me at our mother's house. Our mother just had surgery. Simone kept her voice, even her hands visible, everything exactly where she'd been trained. Not by police, but by years of knowing that her margin for error in situations like this was thinner than it should have been. I'm just stopping for gas. I've got medicine in the back seat for my mother. Decker handed her documents to Price without looking at her. We're going to need you to step out of the vehicle. On what basis? Step out of the vehicle. I'm asking you a reasonable question. I haven't done anything wrong. Can you tell me what you're responding to specifically? What vehicle description? What report? Decker opened her door. Not knocked on it, not waited. He reached down and pulled the handle and opened it, and his body language made it clear that the next step was going to be his hands on her if she didn't move. Got out of the car. She stood on the asphalt in the evening heat, still holding her phone, and watched the third officer materialize from the cruiser. He'd been in the passenger seat this whole time, Sergeant, by the insignia, name tag. He was probably 55, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had never once questioned itself. He walked toward her with his hands behind his back and a slow, deliberate confidence that said he'd done this before. Where you headed? Luttrell asked, friendly. Poisonously friendly, my mother's house. She lives on Crestfield Road. Anyone out here who can verify that? My sister can. She's about 90 minutes behind me on 35, so nobody local. I don't live here, Sergeant. I live in Dallas. I'm visiting. Luttrell nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something. He looked at the car, then back at her. Eyes went to her scrubs. She'd come straight from a shift, hadn't changed, and then to the bag of blood oranges visible through the back window, and the card and the jar of honey, and he made a face she recognized. The face of a man deciding a story didn't add up, even though the story was completely true. You mind if we take a look inside? She minded. She minded extremely. I do mind. Yes, I have medication in the back seat that belongs to my mother. It's prescribed. I have the documentation. I'd prefer you not. It'll just take a minute, Price said from behind her, already reaching for the rear door handle. Please don't open my vehicle. Price opened the vehicle. Stood very still. She tracked all three officers with her peripheral vision, the way she'd learned to track monitors in the ICU, everything, simultaneously, without moving her head. Becker was to her left. Luttrell was directly in front of her. Price was behind her, going through the back seat with gloved hands she hadn't seen him put on. There was a couple at Pump 4 watching. A teenage girl outside the convenience store was very clearly filming on her phone. Noted both without acknowledging either. Sir, she said, directing herself to Luttrell because he was clearly the one running this. I am a registered nurse. I have never had a traffic violation. I have legal documentation for everything in this vehicle. I've no cause to search this car, and I am formally telling you I do not consent to this search. Luttrell was looking at his phone, reading her plates probably. Her. I want to know what report you received. I want a badge number. I want to know the statute you're operating under. Luttrell looked up at her, then really looked at her. The way people look when they want you to understand that your words don't carry weight here. He said, you're making this much harder than it needs to be. But Sergeant Luttrell did not know. What none of them knew was that the woman standing in front of him at Pump 7 was Special Agent Simone Reeves of the FBI's Civil Rights and Law Enforcement Integrity Division. She hadn't told them that she didn't plan to, not yet. She had done, while reaching into the glove box for the registration, was press the emergency Trent function on the device, clipped inside her left wrist underneath her sleeve. A medical alert band. It was not a medical alert band. The moment she'd pressed it, her GPS coordinates, audio feed, and a priority alert had gone to the Dallas field office. She'd bought herself maybe 40 minutes before anyone could get here. She needed to not make things worse for 40 minutes. Came around from the back of the car, holding the prescription bag. A bunch of pill bottles back here. Those are my mother's prescriptions, Simone said, keeping her voice level. Her name is on every label, Dolores Reeves. You can verify the pharmacy if you'd like. Took the bag from Price, looked at the bottles one by one slowly, while Simone stood in the August heat and felt sweat forming at the back of her neck. Hydrocodone, he said, for post-surgical pain prescribed by her surgeon. Documentation is in the bag. That's a controlled substance. I know what it is. I'm a nurse. My mother had it placed 5 days ago. Luttrell handed the bag back to Price. He looked at Simone with something that wasn't quite a smile, but had the same shape. Going to need you to come with us to the station while we sort this out. There it was. No, Simone said, quiet, definitive. Luttrell blinked. People didn't usually say no, I'm sorry. I'm not going to the station. I haven't committed a crime. You have no basis to detain me. I've been cooperative. I've answered your questions. I've provided documentation. If you believe you have cause to arrest me, then arrest me and state the charge. Otherwise, I'm going to pump my gas and continue to my mother's house. She reached for her card at the pump. Decker grabbed her arm. Not hard enough to be outright brutality. He was too practiced for that, but firm enough to spin her and press her against the car hood, with her hands caught between her body and the warm metal. Touch me, she said, still calm. Still controlled, even as her heart rate spiked. Behind your back, Decker said. This is illegal. Behind your back, the zip tie went on too tight. She felt it immediately, the plastic biting into her wrists. She didn't struggle. She held the position, face against the Cadillac's warm hood, and watched the asphalt beneath her feet, and counted her breaths and reminded herself that every second of this was being recorded, transmitted, and time-stamped. The teenage girl at the convenience store was still filming. The couple at Pump 4 had their phones out now, too. Noticed them and said something to Price, who walked toward the girl, hand extended. "Give me that phone," Price said. "You can't take my phone," the girl said. She was maybe 16, with bright red sneakers and the specific brand of courage that belongs to teenagers who don't yet know they should be afraid. "Give me the phone or I'll charge you with obstruction for filming in public." That's not obstruction, she was right. Price grabbed her phone anyway. Simone filed that one away too. They left her zip-tied against the car for what felt like 20 minutes, but was probably 8. Bill made a call. Decker walked back and forth. Price stood over the teenager who'd pulled out a second phone, a backup, and was arguing with him about whether public spaces were public. The couple at Pump 4 drove away. 2 other cars came and went without stopping, drivers clearly reading the scene and deciding not to become part of it. The heat was extraordinary. Simone's scrubs were sticking to her left wrist. Beneath the transmitter, ached where the zip tie pressed against it. She kept her breathing regulated. 4 counts is 4 counts out. Nothing she hadn't done through worse moments in worse rooms. Ian called twice. Simone couldn't answer. Luttrell came back around the hood, crouched down to her eye level with his hands on his knees. "Now we're going to do this the easy way," he said, like the intervening 20 minutes had been her fault. "You're going to tell me whose medication that really is, and where you were actually taking it." "I already told you." "Tell me again." Simone looked at him. The broken capillaries across his nose, the small white scar above his left eyebrow, the shade of his eyes, which were a flat, unremarkable brown. She had spent her career looking at people who used authority as a bludgeon, and she recognized every feature. "As Reeves," she said. 412 Crestfield Road, Harwick. My mother. Hip replacement surgery, Dr. Armando Pietri at Mercy Ridge Medical Center in Dallas. You can call the surgical floor. My name is on the patient contact form." Luttrell stood up. He looked at Decker. Some communication passed between them that Simone couldn't see. "All right," Luttrell said, "we're taking you in." The charge, suspicion of trafficking controlled substances. The words hit the air and Simone absorbed them. She'd known it was possible. She'd calculated it as a move he might make when he couldn't find anything real. But hearing it out loud, standing zip-tied against her sister's car in a gas station parking lot in a town she'd never visited before, with a bag of blood oranges and a get-well card in the back seat, something sharp and involuntary moved through her. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something that had no clean name, but that she'd learned to carry without letting it show. I want to call an attorney," she said. "You can do that at the station." They walked her to the cruiser. She didn't fight it. She got in the back seat, wrists still bounced, and watched through the window as Price stayed behind to wait for the tow truck that Luttrell had apparently already called for the Cadillac. The teenage girl with the red sneakers stood on the sidewalk, watching the cruiser pull away. She held her backup phone at her side screen, dark expression unreadable. Hoped she'd gotten everything. The Harwick Police Department occupied a brick building on Aldrich Street that looked like it had been built as ins and renovated in the 90s and left untouched since. The inside smelled like burned coffee and old carpet. A desk sergeant looked up when they brought Simone in, and something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, more like the practiced neutrality of someone who'd learned not to react to things that probably warranted reacting to. They put her in a room, not a cell, not yet, just room with a metal table and 2 chairs and a camera in the corner that Simone was reasonably certain was recording. Decker cut the zip tie and handed her a form. "Fill that out," he said, and left. Simone sat in the chair and looked at the form, which was a standard intake document. She did not fill it out. She looked at the camera instead. She was calculating 32 minutes had passed since she'd hit the transmitter. The Dallas field office would have dispatched within 5 minutes of receiving her alert protocol, was immediate response for active field agents in duress situations. Drive time from Dallas to Harwick was approximately 2 hours on 35, but there was also the possibility of a closer asset, depending on what was already in the field. She might be looking at 45 minutes. She might be looking at 2 hours. She needed to be very careful about what happened between now and then. Luttrell came in without knocking, which was not surprising. He had a manila folder and a cup of coffee for himself and nothing for her. He sat down across the table and opened the folder and looked at its contents like he was reviewing something important. She suspected the folder was mostly empty. Simone Reeves, he said. Powerless address. Registered nurse working at Vantage Memorial Hospital. He looked up. Right. Yes, no priors. That's correct. So then help me understand why a nurse with a clean record is transporting controlled substances across county lines in a vehicle registered to someone else. Simone looked at him with the flattest expression she could manage. I've explained this 4 times. At what point does this become a pattern of harassment? You're in a police station, Ms. Reeves. I'd be careful about that word. I'd be careful about yours too, Sergeant. Something moved behind his eyes. Recalibration. The medication belongs to my mother, she said one more time. Because she would say it as many times as it needed to be said. Can you have her name? Address. Her doctor's information. The prescription labels. It is a manufactured charge. Luttrell took a slow sip of his coffee. We're just doing our jobs, are you? He didn't like that. She could tell by the way his jaw shifted he was used to people who wilted. People who got scared and started filling in the silences with apologies. Then she wasn't doing that, and it was irritating him in a way he was almost but not quite managing to conceal. You got someone who can come to you, he said. Different angle. Softer voice. My sister, call her. Tell her to come to the station. I'd prefer to call my attorney. That's your right. Slid a desk phone across the table. The cord was frayed near the base. Simone picked it up. She didn't call an attorney, she called Diane. Diane picked up on the second ring, and before Simone could say a word, her sister said, where are you? I've been calling. Mama's asking for you. I'm at the Harwick Police Department, Simone said, on Aldrich Street. A silence, then what I was detained at a gas station. Suspicion of trafficking controlled substances. Another silence, longer this time. Simone. Diane's voice had changed. It was the voice she used in the operating room. Simone thought-controlled and exact, and stripped of everything that wasn't relevant. You hurt? No, okay, don't say anything else. I'm pulling over right now. I'm going to make some calls, and I will be there within the hour. Diane. I know, her sister says, and she hung up. Sergeant Luttrell did not know. What none of them in that building knew was that the second Reeves sister, the one currently pulling off the highway 60 miles north of Harwick, was not just a nurse. Diane Reeves had held a federal appointment to the Northern District of Texas for 6 years. She had sat on 3 federal grand juries, had written 2 opinions that were currently cited in law schools, and she knew the name of every federal marshal in the state, personally. Some sat back in the metal chair and waited 48 miles away. Black SUVs were already moving south on I-35. The SUVs didn't have their lights on. That was the first thing Simone noticed when she heard the tires on the lot out sirens. No announcement, just the deliberate quiet of people who didn't need to announce themselves because their arrival was already enough. She was still in the interview room. Luttrell had left her alone about 20 minutes ago, and in that time she'd been counting ceiling tiles and managing her blood pressure and thinking about her mother's blood oranges, sitting in the impound lot. Medication too, but mostly the oranges, because it was easier to be angry about something small and concrete than something large and systemic. She'd learned that years ago. Let yourself be furious about the small thing. The large thing will take care of itself. The sounds from outside the room changed. Voices multiple. The desk sergeant's tone shifted, and then there was a longer silence than any conversation warranted. Straightened in her chair, the door opened, and it wasn't Luttrell. It was a woman in a dark blazer with an FBI badge clipped to her belt and an expression that communicated she was not here to be patient with anyone. Agent Carla Osi, 40, out of the Dallas V. Simone recognized her, had worked adjacent to her on a case involving a county sheriff up in Wise County 2 years back. Osi took one look at Simone's wrists, where the zip tie marks were still visible, red and raised, and her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Osi said, wrists are sore, otherwise intact. We've got medical standing by outside. I don't need medical. I need my sister's car off the impound hold, and I need those 3 officers in a room. Osi allowed herself a half-second almost smile. One thing at a time, she stepped aside from the doorway, which was a signal. Simone stood up, and for the first time in 2 hours, she walked out of the room without anyone telling her where to go. The front of the Harwick Police Department looked like a different place than the one she'd walked into. There were 4 FBI agents in the lobby, and their presence had rearranged the furniture of the room in some invisible way. The desk sergeant was standing behind his desk, instead of sitting. Becker was against the wall, with his arms crossed, trying to look like he wasn't watching everything. and Price was nowhere visible, which meant someone had already pulled him aside. Luttrell was standing near the front entrance talking to a man in a gray suit who had the specific posture of a federal attorney, and the conversation was not going well for Luttrell. Simone walked through the lobby without stopping. She nodded to two of the agents she recognized, pushed through the front door into the heat, and stood on the steps of the Harwick PD and took a long breath of outdoor air. There were two black Sifferns in the parking lot. A woman in scrubs was standing near one of them medical personnel as promised, and there was a cluster of people on the sidewalk outside the station perimeter who were clearly not law enforcement and were clearly watching. I'd traveled fast in small towns. And then walking from the parking lot toward the steps with a laptop bag on her shoulder and her blazer thrown over one arm because she'd been driving for an hour was Diane. She was wearing a pale blue blouse and slacks, and she'd clearly pulled her hair back in a hurry because several pieces of it were escaping in ways she would not have tolerated under normal circumstances. She looked tired and furious in the specific way of people who have been furious for an hour, while also driving, which requires a particular kind of sustained internal management. She saw Simone on the steps and stopped walking just for a second. Just long enough to catalog the marks on her wrists and the dried sweat at her collar and the exact quality of her expression. Okay. Diane said, "I told you on the phone." I'm asking again. Simone came down the steps and met her at the bottom. "I'm okay. I'm angry." "Those are two different conditions, and I have both." Diane exhaled through her nose. The impound yard already got a call. I was being released. "The prescription medication is being formally logged as legally obtained and transported." She paused. Decker Price. "Yes. I talked to OC on the drive down. She's got the transmitter data, the audio, the timestamps." Diane's voice dropped, not out of uncertainty, but out of precision. "Fine. The audio alone, I know what's on it. There's also footage. The girl at the gas station, the one with the red sneakers." I looked up. "She got it out before Price took her phone." "She had a second one. I know, I saw her." Diane shook her head slowly, in disbelief and something closer to exhausted recognition. "She posted it 40 minutes ago. It's already got 600,000 views." My number landed somewhere in Simone's chest, and she let it sit there. 600,000 people had watched her get zip-tied to the hood of a car in the last 40 minutes. 600,000 people knew what a gas station stop in Harwick, Texas looked like for two black women who weren't doing anything wrong. "Mama doesn't know," Diane said. "It wasn't a question." "No, and she's not going to know tonight. She just had surgery." "She's going to see it anyway. Then she'll see it when she's stronger." Diane looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't, because she knew Simone was right, and also because something was happening behind them at the station entrance. Both of them turned. Luttrell had come outside. He was still talking to the federal attorney, and the conversation had moved past the phase where Luttrell was doing any talking. The attorney Simone would find out later. His name was Walter Grimes, out of the Northern District Office, was speaking in a low, measured voice, while holding a tablet with something on the screen that Luttrell could not look away from. His face had changed completely from the face he'd been wearing in the interview room. That face had been comfortable arranged. The face he was wearing now was the face of someone beginning to understand the shape of what was about to happen to them. "What is he showing him?" Diane asked. "The transmitter data," Simone said. Time-stamped GPS audio, full chain of custody. Diane was quiet for a moment. "And what are they charging them with?" "That's not my decision tonight. That's OC's and Grimes. But you have an opinion." Simone looked at Luttrell's face on the station steps. At the posture of a man who had spent a long time certain that whatever room he walked into, he was the authority. She thought about the zip tie biting into her wrists. She thought about Price taking the teenager's phone. She thought about the word trafficking said flatly, like it cost him nothing. "I have several opinions," she said. "None of them are things I should say out loud yet." They got a room at the motel 2 blocks from the station, not because they were staying, but because Diane needed to make a series of calls that required somewhere quiet and indoors, and the parking lot was starting to collect people with cameras. It was a room with 2 double beds and a window unit that worked intermittently, and a view of the Harwick Water Tower, which had the town's name painted on it in blue letters that were peeling at the edges. Sat on the edge of one bed and looked at her wrists. The marks were still there, pink and raised worse on the left, where the plastic had pressed against the transmitter band. She pressed her thumb into the center of the mark and felt the specific ache of soft tissue that has been compressed too long. The video had 700,000 views by the time she checked. 800. It was moving in increments that were hard to track because the increments kept changing. Touched it. She hadn't wanted to, but she did. It was shot on a phone through the glass of the convenience store door, which gave it a slightly obscured quality that somehow made it worse. You could see her at the pump clearly not doing anything. Nice. You could see Decker approach. You could hear some of it muffled through the glass. And then you could see the moment he spun her toward the car, and the teenager had moved to the door to get a better angle, and the audio cleared up just enough to hear Simone say, "This is illegal," in a voice that was steady and distinct, and somehow more arresting than if she'd been screaming. The comment section was not something she read past the first 10 lines. Diane came back from the bathroom where she'd been pacing and making calls. She had her legal pad with notes on it, which was how Diane processed everything paper, ink, physical lists. She sat on the other bed and put the pad on her knee. Okay. She said the U.S. Attorney's Office out of Dallas is formally opening an investigation. Times is the lead. They're pulling Luttrell's personnel file tonight, and preliminary contact with the Harwick PD's internal review unit indicates there are at least 6 prior complaints against Luttrell, specifically that were internally dismissed. 6 that they know about, since Simone said. 6 that are documented. Diane's pen tapped the pad. There's also a complaint against Price from 18 months ago, involving an unlawful vehicle search, different county, different incident, same pattern. And Decker has a use of force incident from 2021 that was reviewed and closed with no action. Stared at the water tower through the window. So this wasn't a bad day. This was their standard operating procedure. That's what the file suggests. Yes. Neither of them said anything for a moment. I want to talk to the girl, Simone said, the one who filmed it. She lost her phone. She stood her ground when Price tried to intimidate her. She's a minor. She looked like one. And I want to make sure someone's looking out for her interests in all of this. If her footage becomes part of the evidentiary record. Diane wrote something on the pad. I'll have someone from Grimes's office reach out to her family tomorrow. It's almost 9 p.m., Simone, then have them reach out at 9 p.m. Her family deserves to know what's happening before the morning news cycle makes that decision for them. Diane wrote something else. Her penmanship was precise, always had been, even when she was tired. It was a thing that had annoyed Simone enormously as a child, and that she had come to find quietly reassuring as an adult. There's one more thing, Diane said. She hesitated in a way that was unlike her. And Reeves did not typically hesitate. What? Grimes wants you to make a formal statement tonight. The details are current, obviously. He also. Another pause. He asked whether you'd be willing to be present when they formally advised Luttrell of the investigation. Looked at her sister. Not mandatory, Diane said quickly. He was clear about that, but he thought, given your position, given what's documented, your presence would communicate something specific. Wants me in the room. He wants you visible in the room or adjacent to it. Simone thought about Luttrell in that interview room. Sitting across from her with his folder that was probably mostly empty, and his coffee that he hadn't offered to share, and his voice that had the practiced smoothness of someone who had never once been on the wrong side of that table. Grimes. Yes, she said. Diane wrote it down. The statement took an hour and a half. They did it in the conference room of the Harwick PD, an irony that was not lost on anyone, because it was the largest room available with appropriate recording equipment. Grimes ran it. OC was present. A woman from the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ was on video call from Washington, which told Simone more about how high this had already traveled than anything else had. She told it straight through, no editorializing. That's the sequence. A gas station. Off pump. The approach. Documentation she'd provided. The search she'd refused. The moment Decker grabbed her arm. Tie. The trafficking charge. The interview room. The empty folder. She spoke clearly and completely, and when she finished, the room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when everyone in them has understood something at the same time. Asked a few clarifying questions. The DOJ woman asked about the transmitter activation, exactly what she had observed before activating it. Answered everything. When it was over, OC walked with her into the hallway. OC said, keeping her voice low. Most people in your position, first thing out of the room, they'd want to call their supervisor. A personal complaint. Go through channels. I went through my channels, Simone said. Pump 7. OC looked at her. Those marks going to clear up, okay? Good, she paused. Luttrell's in room 3. Is going in now. Simone nodded. She walked to the end of the hallway and stood where she had a clear sight line to the door of room 3. She didn't go in. She didn't need to go in. When Grimes opened the door, The light from inside the room fell into the hallway, and Luttrell, already seated at the table, saw her, watched him recognize her. Not as the woman he'd zip-tied to a car hood, but as something else entirely. Something that was going to require him to recalibrate every assumption he'd made about the evening and how it was going to end. Me. He looked away first. She stayed in the hallway until Grimes closed the door. They drove to their mother's house at 10:30. Diane drove. She'd been the one insisting she take the wheels since she arrived, probably because it gave her something to control when too many other things didn't. The Cadillac had been returned from impound with a formal apology from the Harwick PD's chief of police, which had been delivered through an intermediary, because the chief apparently couldn't manage the words in person. Oranges were still in the back seat. The honey was fine. Card had gotten a little bent at one corner, which annoyed Simone more than the impound itself. Field Road was quiet. Most of the lights on the block were off. Their mother's house was a ranch style with a covered porch and a garden that their mother kept aggressively tended in the months she could manage it, which meant this summer, like the weeks she'd been recovering from surgery, the front beds had gone slightly ragged. Tomato plants needed staking. The rosemary had sprawled into the path. Diane pulled into the driveway and they sat for a moment with the engine off. She's going to see it, Diane said again. I know. She's going to be upset. She's going to be proud and upset simultaneously. How she does that. Diane almost laughed. They got out. The bag. Oranges. Honey. A card with the bent corner. Diane had a key let them in. The house smelled like the specific combination of things their mother used: a particular soap, a particular brand of linen spray, something underneath both of those that had no name, but that meant home in some pre-verbal way that Simone had stopped trying to articulate. Their mother was awake. Of course she was awake. Watchers. Reeves was sitting in her recliner in the front room with the television on low and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead the way she wore them when she'd been fighting sleep and not winning. She was 67 post-surgical, slower than usual, but her eyes when she looked up at both of them coming through the door were completely clear. Long enough, she said to Simone. Simone said. Their mother looked at her for a long specific moment, looked at her wrists, looked at the set of her jaw, looked at Diane's face, which was harder to read but still readable to someone who had been reading it for 40 years. What happened? Said not a question. Set the bag on the coffee table. She pulled out the blood oranges and the honey and the card with the bent corner and put them down, and she sat on the couch across from her mother, and she told her, she didn't spare the details, and she didn't add drama to them, and she didn't watch her mother's face while she spoke, because she knew if she watched her mother's face while she spoke, she'd lose the flatness she needed to get through it. When she finished, the front room was quiet. Then Dolores Reeves said in a voice like gravel wrapped in something soft, "Show me your wrists." Held them out. Her mother looked at them, did not touch them. The car is fine, Simone said. Everything is fine. See that. Her mother pulled her glasses down to her nose and picked up the get well card from the coffee table, looking at the front of it, watercolor image of yellow wildflowers. She opened it and read whatever Simone had written inside, and her expression did something complicated. Then she set it down precisely. You hit the transmitter, their mother said. Yes. Before or after he opened the door? Before. Her mother nodded once slowly. Good girl, that shouldn't have been as steadying as it was. Simone was 38 years old and had spent 14 of those years as a federal agent, and she was not a girl. But the two words hit some part of her that had been standing at attention for 6 hours, and something in her posture released by maybe 2 degrees, which was as much as she was going to allow. Diane came and sat beside her on the couch. The three of them sat in the front room of the house on Crestfield Road while the television ran on low. Nothing, and outside the window Harwick, Texas, was doing whatever small towns did at 11 at night, settling. It's turning off lights, lying quiet. The investigation was in motion. The complaint log was being pulled. The footage had now crossed 1 million views, though none of them knew that yet. What they knew was the house smelled like home, and the oranges were good, and their mother was alive and recovering and looking at both of them over the tops of her reading glasses, with an expression that contained in compressed form everything she knew about raising 2 daughters to stand up in situations that demanded they sit down and be quiet. Simone's phone buzzed on the cushion beside her. She looked at the screen. She stepped outside onto the porch into the warm dark and answered. Tell she said. Ozzy's voice was controlled, but had an undertone that Simone recognized, the slight compression of someone delivering news. They're still processing themselves. We pulled Luttrell's full file, not the internal summary. There are 11 documented complaints going back 8 years. Unlawful stops. Excessive force. One allegation of evidence planting in 2019 that made it to a grand jury and was dropped when the witness recanted. Gripped the porch railing. The wood was warm from the day's heat. Like the 2019 case, she said. Who was the witness? A 19-year-old kid from Harwick. Uncle family. His father worked for the county. She closed her eyes. What happened to the charge against him? The one Luttrell originally filed. There was a pause. Just a beat. Just long enough he did 8 months, O.C. said. Ideal. The planted evidence was the basis of the charge. Air around Simone. Felt very still. There's more, O.C. said. We're finding out how deep it goes. Luttrell has 3 officers under him with overlapping complaint histories. Becker, Price, and a third one who wasn't on scene tonight, an officer named Borland. All 3 were involved in stops with similar patterns over the last 4 years. We're talking at least 20 incidents, Simone. 20 incidents that we can identify tonight. There are probably more. Simone said nothing. The Harwick PD chief, O.C. continued, according to preliminary document review, was aware of at least 4 of the Luttrell complaints and took no action. We're looking at whether there's a supervisory liability issue at the department level. It goes, the chief, Simone said. Looks that way. Who signed off on the internal dismissals. That's what we're establishing. She stood on the porch in the dark and thought about the 19-year-old kid who had recanted his witness statement. Thought about what recanting looked like when your father worked for the county and the cop who'd planted evidence on you was still walking around with a badge. Thought about 8 months. What 8 months at 19 did to a person. Behind. O.C., she said. Athens. The kid from 2019, I want his name. Another pause. Nice. That's going to be part of the formal investigations. I know. I want to know when he's been notified that this is happening. I want to know that someone has called him before this is on the news. Because the pause this time was longer than I'll handle it personally. Thank you. She hung up. She stayed on the porch for another minute, looking out at the quiet street, at the neighbor's porch light across the road, at the moths circling it in slow loops. The footage from the gas station was somewhere on 11 million phones and climbing. Tomorrow morning, Harwick, Texas would wake up to cameras and federal vehicles and questions it had probably been avoiding for 8 years. She went back inside. Her mother and Diane were talking quietly. Diane was showing their mother something on her phone, probably photos, probably not the news yet. And her mother was saying something that made Diane's shoulders drop slightly, in the way they did when she was letting herself relax. Simone sat down and reached for a blood orange. She pulled the peel back, and the smell of it cut through everything else in the room, sharp and sweet and clean. Sigh, her mother asked, without looking up. Fine. Simone split the orange into segments. It's bigger than tonight. Offereds. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and took a segment of the orange from Simone's hand, because that was the kind of woman she was, practical, present, taking what was offered, always, as Dolores said, outside. A second car turned onto Crestfield Road and slowed in front of the house. It sat there for a moment with its lights on, then it pulled forward and kept going. Simone watched it through the window until it disappeared. She didn't sleep well. That wasn't unusual after a high-stress incident. The body stayed in operational mode. For hours after the adrenaline cleared, running threat assessments on things that were threats, replank sequences, looking for errors. Simone lay in her mother's guest room and stared at the ceiling and let her brain do what it needed to do. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep entirely and went to sit in the kitchen with a glass of water and her phone. The footage had crossed 2 million views. Then while she was watching, it crossed 2.1. There were news vans on the feed she'd pulled up. Simone had posted a photo from the street outside the Harwick PD, 3 satellite trucks from Dallas stations already set up on Aldrich Street. They hadn't been there when she and Diane left. They'd arrived in the night the way news cycles did, sudden and hungry. Her phone showed 14 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize and 7 from numbers she did. Her supervisor at the field office, twice the communications director for the Dallas FBI field office once. Her union rep. Twice. A journalist she'd spoken to one time 2 years ago on a different case, which meant someone had given him her number. She turned the screen face down on the table and drank her water. At 5:30, she heard her mother moving in the bedroom. The soft drag of the walker on hardwood, the particular cadence of someone navigating their own house with less mobility than they were used to. Simone got up and met her in the hallway before she could make it to the kitchen alone. I've got it, Simone said. I'm not an invalid, I know. I'll make the coffee. Her mother looked at her for a moment, taking in the fact that Simone was already dressed, clearly hadn't slept, was wearing the expression she wore when she was running calculations. How long have you been up a while? Her mother let herself be steered gently back toward the living room, settled into the recliner. Make it strong and don't burn the milk. Simone made coffee. Nice. She stood at the kitchen counter and listened to the sounds of the house waking up, the hum of the refrigerator, the birds starting outside, Diane's door eventually opening down the hall. Normal sounds. The kind that existed completely independent of news cycles and federal investigations, in a video that had now Simone checked while the coffee was brewing, crossed 3 million views. Anne appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed, laptop under her arm, glasses on. She looked at Simone's face and said nothing, which was its own form of communication. They drank coffee at the kitchen table. Their mother had hers in the recliner with the television on volume low. Local news had picked it up. Simone could hear the anchor's voice from the other room, controlled urgent, the specific register of someone who knows they're on a story that's going somewhere, and then she heard her own name, and her mother turned the volume down further. She doesn't want us to hear her being upset, Diane said quietly. No, we should go check on her. Give her 5 minutes, Simone said. She processes better without an audience. At 7:14 a.m., Simone's phone rang with a number she recognized this time. Walter Grimes, the federal attorney. We've got a problem, he said, which was not how she'd expected him to open. She put down her coffee. Tell me the HRP chief, his name is Wendell Fuqua, called a press conference for 9 a.m. He's planning to make a statement about last night's incident. Kind of statement. His assistant told our office it's a response to, quote, misinformation circulating on social media. Grimes's voice was measured, but the edge under it was unmistakable. He's going to reframe it. Say his officers were responding to a legitimate complaint that the suspect is cops uncooperative, that the situation escalated due to the individual's behavior. Simon set her mug down on the table very carefully. He's going to stand in front of cameras and say that, she said. That's what we're hearing. She looked at Diane across the table. Diane had heard enough from Simone's tone alone and was already opening her laptop. Simone said, what's your office's position? We're filing a formal motion to postpone any public statements from the Harwick PD pending the investigation. But I'll be honest with you, we can't stop him from speaking. First Amendment cuts both ways. He paused. What I'm more concerned about is what he's going to say about you specifically. If he publicly disputes your account before we've had a chance to. If he publicly disputes my account, Simone said, he'll be disputing a time-stamped audio record, GPS database, Whitson footage, and the documented complaint history of 3 of his officers. Him. Talks a beat of silence. Then Grimes said, I need you to understand that once he makes that statement, the media focus on you personally is going to become significantly more intense. Your name, your position, your history with the Bureau. I understand. Are you prepared for that? She thought about the 19-year-old kid who had done 8 months on a plea deal built on planted evidence. She thought about 20 incidents and 11 documented complaints and an internal review system that had functioned, apparently primarily to protect the officers it was supposed to be reviewing. I'm prepared, she said. After she hung up, Diane looked up from her laptop. Aqua is calling a press conference, you heard. I pulled his record while you were on the phone. He's been chief for 9 years. He came up through the department, worked directly under the previous chief, who retired under what is politely as a cloud of controversy in 2016. Diane turned the laptop toward Simone. Get the internal dismissal signatures on those 11 lateral complaints. Looked, 8 of the 11 had been signed off by the same name, Wendell Fuqua. He hadn't just failed to act. He had actively cleared the complaints, every single one. They drove to Aldrich Street at 8:15. Simone hadn't planned to stay at her mother's house and let the federal machinery run without her physical presence in front of it. But the press conference changed the calculus. If Fuqua was going to stand in front of cameras and reconstruct last night's events in his department's favor, then what existed at that location at 9 a.m. needed to include the documented truth. He met them on the sidewalk outside the police station. The news trucks were exactly where the photo had shown them, plus 2 more that had arrived overnight. There were probably 40 people on the street, some press, some local residents, a group of about 15 who were holding handwritten signs, which Simone hadn't expected, and which caused something to shift briefly in her chest before she steadied it. The kid, Simone said before anything else. The one from 2019. Name is Marcus Webb. OC said he's 26 now. He lives about 40 miles from here, works at a distribution center. I called him at 11 last night. She paused. He already knew. He'd seen the video. How is he? OC considered the question. He said, and I'm quoting, "I've been waiting for something like this for 7 years." She looked at Simone steadily. He wants to cooperate with the investigation. He's already called a civil rights attorney. I'm absorbed that 26 years old and 7 years of waiting. There's more. OC said, "We identified 2 other individuals last night from the complaint file, both unlawful traffic stops, both 2021 cases where the charges were eventually dropped, but not before significant legal fees, and 1 case where the individual lost their job due to the arrest record." She glanced toward the police station entrance. Imes' office is reaching out to both of them this morning. Diane had her pad out. "Is this going to be available for the press conference?" "The investigation is ongoing. We're not releasing complaint records publicly." Grimes appeared from somewhere behind them, coffee in hand, suit jacket already on despite the heat. He looked like a man who had been awake for an indeterminate number of hours and was functioning on professionalism and caffeine. All I can do is be present when Fuqua speaks and be available for questions immediately after. "You're going to counter him in real time," Diane said. I'm going to be standing there," Grimes said carefully, "as a federal attorney who has opened a formal civil rights investigation into this department. People can draw their own conclusions about the proximity." The press conference started late. It was 8 minutes past 9 when Fuqua came out, a stocky man in full uniform silver at the temples, an American flag pin on his lapel that caught the morning light. He had the kind of face that had been arranged over many years to project authority without complexity. He stepped up to the podium that someone had set up in front of the station entrance, and he looked out at the assembled cameras with the expression of a man who believed he was about to get ahead of something. Stood at the edge of the press grouping with OC on her left and Diane on her right, and she watched. Fuqua's statement was exactly what Grimes had predicted. He said his officers had received a report. He did not specify from whom a vehicle involved in suspicious activity. He said they had conducted a routine stop that escalated because the individual involved became uncooperative. He said words like protocol and standard procedure and the safety of our officers, with the practiced fluency of someone who had said those phrases so many times, they had lost all specific meaning. He did not say Simone's name. He did not say trafficking. He described the medication as a quantity of controlled substances that required investigation. He said the matter was under internal review. He did not mention that the person he was describing was a federal agent. He did not mention that the vehicle search had been conducted without consent. He did not mention the zip tie. When he opened for questions, 3 reporters spoke at once, and the one whose voice cut through said, "Chief Fuqua, are you aware that the woman detained last night is a special agent with the FBI's Civil Rights Division?" Fuqua's face did something fast and subtle, a micro-adjustment, there and gone. "I'm aware that claims have been made to that effect, yes. The Bureau has confirmed her identity. Do you stand by your characterization of the stop as routine?" "I stand by my officers' assessment of the situation as it presented to them." "Reporter, sir. There's documented audio in which Agent Reeves identified herself and invoked her rights." "Officers," continued the detention. "Can you speak?" "I'm not going to litigate an ongoing internal investigation at a press conference." "Is it still internal? Our understanding is that the federal DOJ has opened a civil rights investigation." Fuqua gripped the podium. It was a small movement, and it was the most honest thing he'd done all morning. That was when Grimes stepped forward. He didn't push anyone aside, didn't raise his voice. He simply moved into the frame and said, clearly, and for every camera present, "I'm Walter Grimes, Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Texas. My office has opened a formal investigation into civil rights violations by officers of the Harwick Police Department. The investigation is active and ongoing. I'm happy to take questions." What followed was 12 minutes that Simone would later describe to her supervisor as the most efficient dismantling of a press conference she had ever witnessed. Grimes was not aggressive. He was simply precise. He answered what he could answer and declined what he couldn't, and the contrast between his specificity and Fuqua's vagueness was a kind of argument all by itself, made in public, in front of every camera that had driven to Harwick that morning. Fuqua left the podium while Grimes was still speaking. He walked back into the station, and the door closed behind him, and the cameras that had been between swung fully toward Grimes, and that was essentially that, he said quietly. "Besides Simone, he just handed us the press cycle." He handed it to himself. We just watched. What happened next came in pieces, and the pieces came fast. At 10:45, Marcus Webb's attorney issued a statement to the press saying his client intended to file civil suit against the Harwich Police Department and 3 named officers, including Sergeant Dale Luttrell, related to an incident in 2019 involving unlawful detention and evidence tampering. At 11:20, a second individual, a 34-year-old woman named Priya Sandoval, who had been unlawfully detained by Officer Price in 2021, contacted Grimes's office and agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation. At noon, a third person came forward, not to the federal office, not to the press. His name was Carl Dieter, 61, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in Harwich for 30 years. He had a documented complaint against Luttrell from 2020 that had been internally dismissed in 23 days with no recorded follow-up. He stood outside the public library on Greer Street with his wife and his complaint number written on a piece of paper, and he talked to 2 reporters for 11 minutes, and then he went home, and those 11 minutes were everywhere by 2 p.m. Simone was back at her mother's house when she watched Dieter's interview clip on her phone. Anne was in the kitchen on a call. Their mother was resting, but she wasn't asleep. Simone could hear the television up, risen on low in her room, the news channel, their mother processing everything in her particular way, which was alone and without being watched. Thought about systemic things. She did this sometimes when cases opened up into their full shapes, took the individual incident, and traced its edges until she could see the whole structure. What she saw here was not an aberration. It was a department that had, over a span of years, evolved a set of internal mechanisms designed to absorb complaints without consequence. Complaint filed, dismissed, officer cleared, returned to full duty. Pattern. Documented by no one, because the documentation was handled by the same office that had the most to lose by recognizing the pattern. And underneath all of it, a chief who had signed his name to 8 of 11 clearances and who had stood at a podium that morning and said the word routine with a straight face. She was still sitting with that when her phone rang. Not Grimes, not OC, a number she didn't recognize, Dallas area code. She almost didn't answer, but something about the specific timing made her pick up. Agent Reeves, a woman's voice measured older. My name is Deputy Inspector Vera Callahan, Affairs Division. Harwich PD. Simone stood up from the couch. Up, Inspector. I want to be clear that I'm calling you independently of Chief Fuqua, independently of his office and without his knowledge. A pause. I've been with this department for 18 years. I've flagged concerns about the complaint handling process on 4 separate occasions. 3 of those occasions predated Fuqua's tenure and 1 was filed during it. One of them resulted in policy change. Simone moved to the kitchen doorway. Anne was still on the phone, back turned. Simone stepped out onto the back porch. Why are you calling me? She said. Because I have documentation of all 4 of those internal reports. And because the 4th one, the one filed during Fuqua's tenure, includes correspondence between Fuqua's office and the County District Attorney's Office from 2019 that I believe directly relates to how the Webb case was handled. The case, the 19-year-old, the 8 months. Anne's hand tightened on the phone. You have correspondence between Fuqua and the DA's office from 2019 relating to the Marcus Webb case. I have emails. I have them. Because when I filed my report, I was given access to internal records as part of the review process, and I copied them before my report was dismissed, and my access was revoked. Another pause. I kept them because I was not sure what would happen, but I knew something would happen eventually. That was 6 years ago. Deputy Inspector Callahan, Simone said carefully, I need you to understand that any material you provide to me personally, I'm not providing them to you personally. I'm telling you they exist, and that I've already contacted a federal attorney this morning. Named Grimes, Walter Grimes. Yes, his assistant told me he was unavailable. I'm telling you, so that someone in your office can make sure that call gets prioritized, because I believe what I have changes the scope of this investigation significantly. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not fear, but the particular tension of someone who has been holding something for a long time and is finally putting it down. If Fuqua knew the evidence against Webb was fabricated and coordinated with the DA's office to prosecute anyway, this isn't just a civil rights violation. This is obstruction conspiracy. It involves at minimum 2 offices. The back porch of her mother's house was a 5x8 concrete pad with 2 lawn chairs and a tomato plant in a pot that needed water. Simone stood in the middle of it and looked at the yard and processed what she'd just heard. The inspector, she said. Are you safe? A short pause. I'm at home. My husband is here. Stay there. Don't contact Fuqua's office. Don't communicate with anyone at the department till you hear from Grimes directly. I'm going to make sure his office calls you within the hour. All right. And Deputy Inspector, you did the right thing. 4 times you tried to do the right thing that matters. When Callahan spoke again, her voice was slightly different, like something had shifted a fraction. I should have gone further. 6 years ago, I should have gone further. You're going further now, she hung up. As she went back inside, crossed to Diane in the kitchen and put her hand on her sister's arm until Diane turned and read her face and cut her own call short. Diane said. Simone told her quickly, no embellishment, just the sequence. Diane's expression changed in increments as she listened. Not surprise, but a progressive hardening of attention, the look she got when something large was requiring her to reorganize around it. Simone finished. Diane said if the DA's office was involved in prosecuting Webb, knowing the evidence was planted. The conspiracy charge covers both offices, the current DA. Don't know yet. Callahan referenced correspondence from 2019. The current day Harlan Mote has held the office since 2018. Diane's pen was in her hand, which was automatic. She'd picked it up from the counter without looking. It was in office during the Webb case. Yes, the kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Needs to know this in the next 10 minutes, Diane said. Call him, tell him Callahan is at home waiting. Tell him to pull her report to his direct line and tell him we think this extends to the DA's office. Diane was already dialing. Simone went to the refrigerator and got a glass of water and drank half of it standing there because her hands were doing the thing they sometimes did after large developments. A tremor that wasn't quite a tremor. More like the body acknowledging that the adrenaline was back before the brain had consciously registered it. This was no longer a gas station stop that had gone badly. This was a system, an interlocking system of protection and concealment that had been running for at minimums 6 years and possibly longer, involving a police department, an internal affairs office that had been quietly muzzled. And if Callahan's emails said what she was suggesting, they said the district attorney's office that was supposed to provide independent oversight. Underneath all of it, Marcus Webb had served 8 months. Luttrell had continued working, and Fuqua had kept signing dismissals. At 9 a.m. that morning, Fuqua had stood at a podium and said the word routine. On's phone buzzed, not a call, a text from Osi. Nathan's call me now, she called. Osi picked up on the first ring. We have a problem at the station, Osi said. Luttrell's attorney filed an emergency motion an hour ago, claiming the transmitter evidence was improperly obtained because you failed to identify yourself as a federal agent during the initial contact. On's eyes went flat. That's not how, I know it's not how it works. Knows it's not how it works. But the motion creates a 36-hour window while it's reviewed, during which Luttrell's attorney is arguing his client's administrative suspension should be lifted. He's trying to get Luttrell back on the street. He filed it with Judge Patricia Hume, local federal bench. Grimes is responding, but OC stopped. But Judge Hume has a prior professional relationship with Harlan Mote. They were at the same law firm for 6 years before she went to the bench. The glass was still in Simone's hand. She set it down on the counter before she could do anything regrettable with it. She said, I need you to listen carefully because in the next 20 minutes, several things are going to happen at once. She told OC about Callahan, told her about the emails, talked to her about the DA. Then she told her what she thought they needed to do next, speaking quickly and precisely, and when she was done, OC was silent 3 seconds and then said, You understand that if the judge rules in Luttrell's favor on the motion, walks out of administrative suspension and back into active duty. Yeah. Which means he's a credentialed officer again for the duration of the review period. And if Fuqua is coordinating with him during that window, he'll be working to shape what witnesses say and what documents get reviewed before we can get to them. Simone looked at the kitchen doorway. Anne was still on the phone, voice low, Callahan said. She kept copies, but there may be originals in the department's records that Fuqua can access. I'll pause. Then OC said very quietly, You think he'll move to destroy them? Nathan, I think if Luttrell gets his badge back for 36 hours and Fuqua still has access to the department's record system, yes, I think that's a real risk. The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. I'm calling Grimes, OC said. Tell him about the judge too. Already writing it down. They hung up. Simone stood in the kitchen of her mother's house in Harwick, Texas on a Thursday morning in August, with her wrists still marked from the night before, and she understood that the next several hours were going to determine whether what had happened at Pump 7 was the beginning of accountability or the beginning of a cover-up that had resources and legal mechanisms, and a 36-year professional network behind it. Anne ended her call. She looked across the kitchen at Simone. Grimes is pulling Callahan's contact immediately, she said. Also, She stopped. She'd read something in Simone's face. What happened? Luttrell's attorney filed a motion to lift the administrative suspension. Diane stared on what? Grounds they're claiming improper evidence collection. That's... Diane stopped herself. She took a breath. Who's the judge, Patricia Hume. Diane, who had spent 6 years on the federal bench and knew every appointment in the Northern District, and had attended the same judicial conference as Patricia Hume 3 times, closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, her expression had arrived at a place beyond anger, something quieter and more absolute. And Moat, she said, same firm 6 years. Diane picked up her phone. She didn't explain who she was calling. Walked out of the kitchen, and Simone heard the back door open and close, and her sister's voice outside, low and clear and precise, speaking to someone whose name Simone didn't catch. Simone looked at the half-empty water glass on the counter. She thought about the way systems protected themselves. Fucking pieces. The cleared complaints. The dismissed reports. The prosecuted 19-year-old. The attorney and the judge in the 36-hour window that someone had calculated would be just long enough to do damage that couldn't be undone. She picked up her phone and called O.C. back. One more thing, she said. Marcus Webb. I need him in a safe location with his attorney before end of day. I think he's the key witness in a conspiracy case that now potentially involves the DA's office. I think. If Luttrell gets 36 hours of active status and knows Webb has agreed to cooperate, she let the sentence finish itself. O.C.'s voice went very still. I'll make the call. Thank you. She ended the call outside the kitchen window. She could see Diane on the back porch, still talking, one hand flat against the porch railing, the posture of someone who is choosing their words with surgical precision. A tomato plant in the pot cast a small shadow across the concrete. Somewhere, across town, in the Horwick Police Department, Fuqua had access to 30 years of records and a 36-hour window that was right now ticking. And in a courtroom in Dallas, a judge with a prior professional relationship with the district attorney was reviewing a motion that had been filed specifically to open that window. Phone lit up with a text from a number she'd never seen before. No name. No preamble, just an address in Harwick and 4 words, he knows you're here. Right. She stared at the text for 4 seconds, then she screenshotted it, forwarded it to O.C., and walked to the back door. Diane, she said. Her sister turned reader face. I've ended her call mid-sentence. Simone showed her the phone. Diane looked at the message, looked at the address, looked back at Simone. That's 2 blocks from the station, Diane said. I know. Hi. Who sent it? I don't know yet. Simone was already pulling up the number, running it through the Bureau's contact database on her phone, unregistered prepaid. Could be Callahan. Could be someone else in the department who's been watching and decided tonight was the moment. It could be someone trying to draw you out. Yes. She didn't dismiss it. She turned it over, waited. Someone who wanted to lure her away from the house would pick an address near the station because it sounded plausible. Someone who genuinely wanted to warn her would pick the same kind of address for the same reason. The message itself told her nothing about intent. What it told her was that someone inside the Harwick apparatus knew she was at her mother's house, and that knowledge was its own kind of threat regardless of who was delivering it. I'm not going to the address, she said. Diane exhaled. I need to know who sent this. She typed a message back to the unknown number. Who is this sent it? Touched the screen. 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then disappeared, and appeared again. The response, someone who's been here longer than Fuqua. Address is where he keeps his secondary files. Physical copies. He's been moving things since this morning. Fine. Read it twice, forwarded it to O.C. without a word. Phone rang 8 seconds later. That address, O.C. said, is a property registered to a holding company. I'm running it now, but it's going to take... It's Fuqua's, Simone said. Connected to him. The source says he's been moving physical files there since this morning. Physical files. Originals, not copies. If Callahan's emails are copies of correspondence that exists in the department's physical records, and Fuqua moves those originals before we can subpoena them, it's become harder to authenticate without the originals. For comparison, O.C. finished. A good defense attorney could argue they were altered. That's the play, Simone said. Luttrell's attorney files the emergency motion, creates the 36-hour window. Fuqua uses the window to move or destroy the physical records, and by the time Grimes gets a subpoena executed, the originals are gone. Silence. Then O.C. said, I need to call Grimes. And O.C. tell him we need an emergency preservation order covering all Harwick PD physical and digital records. Now, before the motion gets any further along. If Grimes can get that order filed in the next hour. Touching anything becomes obstruction. Exactly. I hung up. Simone looked at Diane. Can you get Judge Hume's recusal on the record before she rules on the motion? Diane had her legal pad already. I'm not the attorney of record in this proceeding, but I know who to call. She was already dialing go check on Mama. Simone went. Their mother was in the recliner with the television off now, which was different from before Dolores Reeves turned the television off when she was thinking seriously about something, the way some people needed music, and she needed silence. She looked up when Simone came in, and her eyes were clear and alert despite the pain medication schedule and the fact that it was not yet noon. You need to leave, her mother said not unkindly. I'm not leaving. You need to be wherever the work is. That's not here. She shifted in the recliner, adjust the pillow behind her lower back with the careful precisions of someone navigating post-surgical discomfort. I am not fragile. I had my hip replaced. My brain works fine. I know, Mama. Then stop treating this house like it's where you're hiding. Simone stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at her mother and thought about all the years she'd watched this woman navigate rooms that didn't want to accommodate her hospital floors, administrative offices, places where authority was used as a door instead of a tool, and how she'd done it with exactly this quality, this specific combination of clarity and forward momentum. There's a secondary location, Simone said. We think Fuqua is moving physical records to cover his trail. Go cover it. Diane is on the phone, and I have had a hip replacement, not a lobotomy. Calms. Her mother's voice was steady. Go do what you came here to do, not the visit, the other thing. Looked at her for a long moment. I came here to visit you. You came here to visit me, and something found you. Her mother looked at the window, at the bright square of August morning. That's been true your whole life. Something always finds you, Simone. You just have to decide whether you're going to face it or fuss about where you're standing when it arrives. The address was a commercial storage facility on Rankin Road, up blocks east of the police station. The kind of place with a keypad gate and individual units and a security camera at the entrance that was positioned to capture vehicles entering, not faces. Didn't go inside. She parked on the street half a block west and watched from the car and waited for OC. Arrived 11 minutes later in one of the suburbans with an agent named Treviso who Simone had worked with once on a financial crimes case. Was the kind of quiet that came from competence rather than shyness, and he had a tablet in his lap showing the property registration query results. A holding company is Rankin Road Storage LC, he said, not looking up from the tablet. Registered. 2018. 3 shareholders of record. One of them is a name you'll recognize. He turned the tablet towards Simone. A third shareholder was listed W. Fuqua. Not Wendell Fuqua. It's W. Fuqua. The kind of minimal disclosure that was technically compliant and practically obfuscating. He owns part of the building, Simone said, 12%, which means he has gate access, unit access, and no legal obligation to disclose his presence here to the department. Treviso took the tablet back. He's been here twice this morning. Camera captured his vehicle at 4:47 a.m. and again at 9:52. 9:52. 50 minutes after the press conference ended. At home. Watched himself on the news. I even drove here. As he said, it's that way. Treviso pulled up the gate camera feed, which was on a 30-minute delay for the live view. His vehicle is currently on site. Simone looked at the facility entrance. Pickup truck was visible just inside the gate, parked at an angle near one of the middle units. What's the status on the preservation order? She said. Filed it 40 minutes ago, OC said. It's being reviewed by the duty judge. The moment it's signed, any movement of those records becomes obstruction. She paused. It hasn't been signed yet. How long could be 20 minutes? Could be 2 hours. Depends on the judge's docket. Which meant that right now at this moment, Fuqua was inside that facility, moving or destroying physical records, and there was nothing they could do about it legally except watch and document and wait. Moved at the speed. It moved and it did not speed up for urgency. Which was a thing Simone had made her peace with over 14 years in the Bureau, and then occasionally had to make her peace with. Again, when between the law's speed and the situation's speed was visible and costly. Document everything, she said. Every vehicle movement, every timestamp. If he brings anything out, get it on camera. Treviso was already recording. They waited the heat built in the suburban car, and the gate camera ran on its delay, and Simone watched the white truck through the facility entrance and did not move. At 12:43, the truck pulled out of the facility and turned east on Rankin Road. Was on the phone immediately. Simone watched the truck until it was out of sight, And then she looked at her phone, and at 12:46, it buzzed with a text from Grimes' order signed. Active. As of 12:44 p.m., 2 minutes after Fuqua had driven away. Timed it. Simone said not to anyone in particular. He may not have known about the order, O.C. said carefully. He knew about the motion. He knew the window. He's been in that building since 6:47 this morning. She looked down the empty road where the truck had gone. He knew about the order specifically doesn't matter. He knew the timeline. What happened in the next 4 hours was not a single dramatic moment. It was a sequence of procedural events that were individually unglamorous and collectively devastating. And Simone had learned earlier career that most real accountability worked exactly like that. Not a door kicked open, a series of smaller doors, each one revealing the next. Grimes' office executed the preservation order on the Harwick PD at 1:15 p.m. Two federal agents walked into the building with a federal judge's signature and the authority to freeze every physical and digital record in the department pending the investigation. The desk sergeant, the same one who had maintained careful neutrality the night before, looked at the paperwork, looked at the agents, and picked up the phone to call Fuqua. He was told that Fuqua was unavailable. He called again. Same result. Fuqua was at that moment at a property on the south side of Harwick that was registered to his brother-in-law. 3 agents from OC's team were parked outside it. At 2 p.m., the duty judge's clerk called Grimes' office and informed them that Judge Patricia Hume had recused herself from the Luttrell suspension motion. No explanation was given on the record, but the clerk mentioned off the record to Grimes' paralegal that the judge had received a call from a colleague that morning that had prompted a conflict of interest review. The case was reassigned to Judge Octavia Marsh, who had no professional history with anyone in Harwick County and who, by 3:15 p.m., had not only denied Luttrell's motion but extended the administrative suspension to include Decker and Price, pending the federal investigation. At 3:30, Vera Callahan arrived at Grimes' office in Dallas with a hard drive. On the hard drive were scanned copies of every internal report she had filed over 18 years, including the 4 that had been dismissed without action, including the 2019 report with its attached email correspondence between Chief Fuqua's office and the office of District Attorney Harlan Mote, called Simone when he'd reviewed the first 20 pages. It's worse than Callahan described, he said. His voice had the flattened quality of someone who was trying to stay in professional mode and finding it slightly difficult. Tell me the correspondence from 2019 includes an email from Fuqua's personal email address. Not his department account, his personal one to Mote's personal email address. The email references, and I'm reading directly the web situation, and asks Mote to, quote, make sure the charge holds regardless of the evidentiary questions. Mote's response is dated the same day. It says already handled. Talk to the public defender's supervisor. It'll take the deal. Simone sat down on the edge of the guest bed in her mother's house because her legs had decided the floor was a reasonable option, and she was overriding that with the compromise of sitting. They coordinated with the public defender's office, she said. That's what the email suggests. We're pulling the public defender's personnel records from 2019 to find out who supervised the attorney who handled Webb's case. A pause. If a supervisor in the public defender's office was told to push a plea deal on a case with fabricated evidence, we're looking at coordinated miscarriage of justice across 3 separate institutions. She thought about Marcus Webb, 26 years old. 7 years of waiting. Has Webb been notified about the email? His attorney will be briefed this afternoon. We want him present for that conversation. He should have someone with him, family, not just the attorney. Mother is already with him, Grimes said. OC arranged it. Let herself feel briefly grateful for that then. What about Fuqua? We're in the process of arranging a voluntary interview request. We'll move to compulsory. Another pause longer. His attorney called our office 20 minutes ago. Fuqua is claiming the records movement this morning was routine administrative relocation and predates the preservation order. 2 minutes. Yes. Which his attorney will argue was not knowingly in violation of an order that hadn't been signed yet, but was in the unit. That's what we're working on. We have the camera documentation of him entering and leaving. We're seeking a warrant for the storage unit itself to determine what, if anything, remains there and what condition it's in. Walked to the window. Grimes. Yeah. The public defender's supervisor from 2019. If they were pressured or coordinated with, they may be willing to talk now. especially now that this is federal and public already on our list. Vacant. Make it the top of the list. If we can establish that Webb's own public defender was compromised, the conspiracy charge becomes airtight. A brief silence. Then you should know that 3 more people called our tip line this afternoon. 2 with experiences involving Luttrell and 1 involving Price. Different incidents, different years, all from Harwick. She closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, in the particular exhaustion of confirmed patterns. Every additional person who called was another person who had been carrying something for years with nowhere to put it. Process. All of them, she said obviously. After she hung up, she stood at the window for a long time and watched the street. Afternoon had gotten thick with heat haze, the kind that made distances look uncertain. A kid on a bicycle moved through the shimmer at the end of the block. 2 women talking at a mailbox across the street. Normal Thursday afternoon in a small town that was beneath its surface, currently being taken apart piece by piece. Diane appeared in the doorway. Webb's attorney called me. They wanted a federal judge's contact for the civil suit. I gave them Marsh's clerk. Good, Simone turned from the window. Hands drive, Grimes got it. He called me too. On the same call list, apparently. A ghost of something moved across Diane's face. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. He said worse than described. He told me the same. Diane leaned against the doorframe. She was still in the clothes she'd been wearing since early that morning. Her blazer long since draped over a chair. Her legal pad now thick with notes, pages filled edge to edge with her precise handwriting. She looked tired in the way that came from sustained intensity, not from lack of sleep specifically. I keep thinking about that press conference, she said. Aqua, standing at that podium. Don't, Simone said. I'm not angry about it. Diane searched for the word. He genuinely believed it was going to work. He stood there and said routine and protocol, and he believed the frame was going to hold. She shook her head slightly. That's what 9 years of impunity does. It makes people bad at calculating risk. It makes them bad at imagining consequences, Simone said. That's different. Diane looked at her. Fuqua could calculate risk. Fine, Simone said. He calculated the motion. Up the window. Up the storage unit. Up the personal email accounts. He thought through the logistics. She turned back to the window. He just couldn't imagine that the consequences would actually reach him. Those aren't the same failure. At 5:20 p.m. it reached him. Fuqua's attorney had been negotiating the terms of a voluntary interview all afternoon, requesting delays, requesting the meeting be held at his attorney's office rather than the federal building, requesting various conditions that Grimes granted some of and declined others. The attorney had apparently not been communicating to his client was the rate at which the evidentiary record was expanding. Because when Fuqua finally arrived at the federal building in Dallas at 5:40 for what his attorney had presumably framed as a manageable conversation, he walked into a room where Walter Grimes had a 47-page preliminary evidence summary on the table and Ver Callahan scanned documents displayed on a screen. Simone wasn't in that room. She was in the observation area with Osai, watching through the glass. Fuqua looked like a different person than the man at the podium. The posture was the same. It was probably the posture he'd had so long it was structural, but something inside it had changed. He sat down across from Grimes and his attorney sat beside him, and Grimes set the 40s and pages on the table without saying anything, and Fuqua looked at the cover page. The cover page had his name on it, his home address, his business address on Rankin Road, his personal email address. She watched him read those 3 lines and understand what reading them meant. His attorney leaned over and murmured something. Fuqua didn't respond. He was still looking at the cover page. Chief Fuqua, Grimes said, I want to make clear that you're here voluntarily today, that you're entitled to have your attorney present, and that you can terminate this interview at any time. I also want to make clear that this is the only voluntary conversation we're going to have. After today, anything further will be compulsory. He opened his own copy of the summary. Let's start with Marcus Webb. Simone watched Fuqua's jaw work. Watched him. Look at his attorney. Watched his attorney. A man named Brossard, who had been practicing in Harwick County for 20 years, and who suddenly looked like a man who had not fully prepared for the room. He was sitting and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Right. Fuqua looked back at Grimes. He said, "I'd like to speak to my attorney privately." "Thanks." "Of course," Grimes said. He stood gathered, nothing left the room. Glass. Through the glass, Simone and Osi watched Brassard lean toward his client and begin talking. Fuqua listened. His face went through several things. At one point he pressed both hands flat on the table, which was a gesture that had the quality of a man trying to stabilize something. "He's going to ask for a deal," Osi said. "He's going to ask about a deal," Simone said. "Asking and getting are different. Grimes isn't going to give him much." "No, he should have thought about that at 6:47 this morning." Osi's voice was controlled, but there was something in it, something dry and exact, that made Simone glance at her. Osi's face was professional. But she'd been awake for over 20 hours and had driven 2 hours in the dark to a small Texas town to uncuff a colleague from a gas station hood, and whatever she was carrying about that was present just underneath the professional surface. "You didn't have to come personally last night," Simone said. Osi shrugged. "You transmitted half the field office could have." "I was already in the car when the alert came in," Osi said. "I'd driven down to Waxahachie for a thing. I was 40 minutes out." She paused. "And it was your transmitter. I've worked adjacent to you for 4 years." I wasn't going to let someone else." She stopped, recalibrated. Anyway, I was close." Simone looked at her for a moment. Thank you. Don't make it strange." "I'm not. You're making it strange." Inside the interview room, Brassard had finished talking. Fuqua was looking at the table. He nodded once slowly. Grimes was called back in. What Fuqua offered in the next 90 minutes was partial, strategic, and self-serving in the specific way of someone who had spent a career watching other people make deals and understood the mechanics without fully grasping that the mechanics worked differently when you were who'd spent 9 years building the house. He admitted to awareness of concerns about Luttrell's complaint history. He framed it as insufficient information, poor internal communication, systemic failures he'd been trying to address. He admitted to the emails with Moat said they'd been taken out of context, that handled meant he'd ensured proper procedure was followed, that regardless of evidentiary questions had been imprecise language for a private communication. He denied coordinating with the public defender's office. He denied the evidence in the web case had been fabricated. He denied moving files this morning to obstruct the investigation, characterizing it as administrative work he'd planned weeks ago. Grimes listened to all of it. He asked questions in a measured, steady voice that gave nothing away. He did not raise his voice once. He did not at any point indicate what he believed or disbelieved. He simply asked the next question, and the next, building a record with the patience of someone who was not in a hurry, because the evidence was not going anywhere. And it was over. Fuqua and Brassard left. The attorney had asked about immunity twice. Grimes had neither confirmed nor denied its availability and had not initiated the conversation. Left the observation area and found Grimes in the hallway. "Well," she said. He straightened his jacket. His account of the emails is not consistent with the totality of the correspondence. Hand's documents include 4 more emails between those 2 accounts that he didn't reference, one of which explicitly discusses the public defender's supervisor by name and asks Moat to, quote, "make sure Radner keeps the kid focused on the deal." Radner. "The supervisor's name. Have you contacted Radner?" "Office. His office is pulling his employment records from 2019 as of this afternoon." He left the public defender's office in 2021. We're locating him." Grimes looked at his watch. "I also want to be transparent with you about where we are. We have enough for federal charges against Luttrell, Decker, and Price on the civil rights violations. That's solid. Conspiracy charges involving Fuqua and Moat are strong but require Radner or someone in the DA's office to corroborate." Corroboration. "A good defense attorney argues the emails are ambiguous." They're not ambiguous. I know that you know that. I need a jury to know that without reasonable doubt." He met her eyes. "We're not there yet," she understood. 18 years. had given her a precise sense of the distance between close and there, and she respected that Grimes was being exact with her rather than reassuring. "That's Moat's status," she said. "He's been contacted and declined the voluntary interview. We're preparing the compulsory notice." Grimes allowed himself a fraction of expression, something between grim and satisfied. Right. He declined within 4 minutes of being contacted, which his attorney will later probably wish he hadn't. At 7:15, Simone was in the federal building parking lot getting into a car to drive back to Harwick when her phone rang. The number was familiar now. Vera Callahan. "They came to my house," Callahan said. Her voice was steady but compressed in a way it hadn't been that morning. Simone stopped moving. "Who came to your house?" "2 men, not uniformed. They said they were from the department's internal affairs division. But I know everyone in internal affairs, and I didn't recognize either of them. They said they needed to collect my department-issued equipment. My badge, my laptop." A pause. "I didn't let them in. My husband stayed at the door." "You did the right thing." "Are they still there?" "They left 20 minutes ago. That's why I waited to call. I wanted to make sure they were gone." "You need to leave your house tonight. You and your husband." "Fine. Go somewhere you haven't mentioned to anyone at the department, not a regular place." "Are you saying they'd..." "I'm saying that 2 unidentified men showed up at your home within hours of you handing evidence to a federal attorney, and I'm not willing to assume their intentions were administrative." Simone was already walking back toward the building. "I'm going to have an agent come to you tonight. They'll escort you to a secure location. Don't take calls from department numbers until you hear from me directly." She could hear Callahan breathing. The steadiness was real, but it was costing something. I've been in that department for 18 years, Callahan said. I never thought. I know, I've been afraid of this for 6 years, and I still didn't think they'd actually... You're safe. We're going to make sure you're safe. Just stay inside until the agent arrives. After she hung up, she found Ozzy in the building lobby and told her. Ozzy's expression didn't change much, but she made one call quick and direct, and an agent was dispatched to Callahan's address within 5 minutes. Simone stood in the lobby and felt the case shifting again, not widening this time, but deepening, the investigation hitting a floor beneath the floor it had already found. Someone in Fuqua's orbit was willing to send unidentified men to a woman's home. That meant the voluntary interview had not produced the conciliatory response Brossard had probably promised his client it would. That meant someone had made a call after Fuqua left the building, and that call had set something in motion. She called Grimes, I heard, he said, which meant OC had already looped him. It's escalating on their end, she said, I know. Which means they know the emails are damaging enough to make this kind of move. Which means, Grimes said, we need Radnor before they find him first. The parking lot outside the federal building was half empty in the early evening, the sky doing something orange and purple above the Dallas skyline that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Some stood in it and thought about the shape of what they had. The 3 officers, the chief, the emails, the DA. And somewhere out there, a man named Radnor, who had left the public defender's office in 2021 and who was the thread that connected the individual acts of misconduct to the coordinated conspiracy underneath them. How far along is the location effort, she said. We have an address in San Marcos. Agent should be there within the hour, and if he's been contacted by Fuqua's people before we get there. Then we document that contact as additional evidence of obstruction. A pause. Go back to your mother's house. You've been in operational mode for 20 hours. My office. Handle the Radnor contact tonight. I know. Are you going back? Yes, she said, and she meant it. She just stood in the parking lot for another 2 minutes first, running the thread from Webb to Radnor to Moat and back again, looking for the gap that Fuqua's defense would eventually find, the point where the chain of accountability could be argued to be incomplete. She didn't find it. That didn't mean it wasn't there. Attorneys were good at finding what wasn't visible from the prosecution side. She would think about it more when she'd slept. She got in the car and drove south on I-35 and let the highway noise fill the space where thinking had been. Her phone buzzed at 8:40, a text from a number she now recognized, Grimes's personal cell, which he'd given her that morning. Butner is gone. San Marcos address cleared out. Neighbors say he left with bags 2 days ago. Nice. 2 days ago, before last night. At the gas station. Before any of this was public. Someone had warned him 2 days ago. But she pulled off the highway at the next exit and sat in a gas station. Lot. Not the Falcons Reach, a different one. Smaller, no cameras, she could see and read the text again and let the implications arrange themselves. Butner had been warned before the incident at the gas station. Which meant someone had known before last night that something was coming. This specifically. Not Simone at Pump 7, but something. Investigation, some threat, some reason to start moving a person who could corroborate a conspiracy. Which meant the leak was not in Grimes's office, not in the federal building, not in anything that had started moving last night. The leak was older than last night, she called Grimes. He picked up on the first ring. You're thinking what I'm thinking, she said. Yes. He said someone inside the federal system knew about a prior investigation into Harwick before last night. This isn't a reaction to you. This has been in motion for longer than we thought. Which investigation, she said. Who's the silence on the line stretched for 4 seconds? 5. That, Grimes said slowly, is what we don't know yet. Not. She sat in the gas station lot with the engine idling and the highway noise behind her and the August dark ahead, and she thought about a 36-hour window that had been calculated too precisely in a storage unit, visited at 6:47 in the morning, before anyone had made a public move, and a man who had packed bags and left San Marcos 2 days before a gas station stop in Harwick had put any of this on the national news. Someone had seen this coming before she had, and they had used the time to make sure that when it arrived, the most important witness was already gone. She drove the rest of the way to Harwick in the kind of silence that wasn't really silence, highway noise, the occasional truck, the radio she'd turned off an hour ago, leaving a residue of quiet that her brain kept trying to fill. Development sat in her chest like a stone. She couldn't dislodge, not because it destroyed what they'd built, but because it reshaped it. That seemed to have a ceiling had floors beneath their floors, and she'd learned that the floors beneath floors were where the most durable truth lived, but getting to them cost something. Inside a federal structure had warned Radnor 2 days before a gas station stop in Harwick had made any of this visible. That meant a prior investigation. She didn't know about a thread that someone had been pulling quietly somewhere before she'd ever driven into Harwick County. She needed to find that thread. Not tonight, soon. Her mother's house was mostly dark when she pulled into the driveway. Lamp on in the living room, which meant Diane was still up. The rest of the block was quiet, the kind of Thursday night quiet that small towns produced effortlessly, the complete absence of urgency that felt strange against everything she was carrying. She sat in the car for a moment and let herself be tired. Not think about being tired, not manage it. Just let it be there. The full accumulated weight of 22 hours that had started at a gas pump and had taken her through a detention room, a motel, a mother's living room, a press conference, a storage facility, a federal building, and a gas station parking lot, where she'd sat with a text message and understood that what she was looking at was bigger and older than she'd thought. She got out and went inside. Diane was at the kitchen table with her laptop and what appeared to be her third cup of coffee. Because Diane processed sustained crisis with caffeine and legal pads, and the specific refusal to go hospital until she had organized the information into something she could act on. When Simone came in, Radnor, Diane said. To Grimes. He called 20 minutes ago. He wanted to know if I had any contacts in the Western District who might have had a prior investigation touching Harwick County. Diane's expression was controlled, but there was something in it, a tightness around the eyes that wasn't just fatigue. I made 4 calls, she stopped. What? There was a prior investigation. It was opened 18 months ago by the Civil Rights Division out of the Houston field office. A complaint from a Harwick County resident about a pattern of unlawful stops. Was assigned to an agent named Terrence Hollis. She looked at her sister steadily. It was closed 7 months ago, reason given insufficient evidence. I stood very still in the kitchen doorway. Hollis filed a closure report, Diane continued. But 3 weeks before the closure, he sent an internal memo to his supervisor flagging concerns about the evidentiary record, specifically that documents he'd requested from the Harwick PD had arrived incomplete. The memo was acknowledged and then not acted on. The case closed on schedule. Hollis's supervisor, a section chief named Burton Graves out of the Houston office. Diane's voice was flat and precise. Burton Graves was a law school contemporary of Harlan Mote. They overlapped for 2 years at the same Dallas firm in the late 90s before Graves went federal. The kitchen was very quiet. Mote's network, Simone said. It goes into the federal structure. That's what it looks like. Radner was warned. Not because someone in Grimes's office talked. Because someone in the Houston field office knew an investigation had touched Harwick before, and when things started moving last night, they made a call. Anne closed her laptop. Graves is the leak, possibly. For someone in Graves's chain of command, or Graves is clean, and someone used access to his office's records. She pushed off the doorframe and sat down at the table. Any of those possibilities point to the same place. Affairs. Diane said FBI's, yes. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a dog barked once and went quiet. I need to make a call I don't want to make, Simone said. Director General. Yes. Diane looked at her. It's a long road. I know what it is. Simone rubbed the back of her hand across her jaw, a gesture she only made when she was past the point where appearances mattered. If there's a network that reaches from a county DA's office into a federal section chief's supervision, and that network has been suppressing civil rights complaints and warning witnesses, then what happened at that gas station is the surface of something that has been protected at multiple levels for years. She looked at her sister. I am not interested in the surface anymore. Diane was quiet for a moment. It's going to take time, I know. It's going to be costly. For you professionally, for your caseload. For Diane, Simone met her eyes. I know what it costs. I've always known what it costs. That's not a reason not to do it. Her sister looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once and opened her laptop again. I'll help you document the initial referral. They worked for 2 hours at the kitchen table, the way they'd done homework at this same table, when they were teenagers side by side, mostly quiet, the silence between them functional rather than empty. At midnight, they had a preliminary referral document for the Office of the Inspector General, outlining the connection between the prior Houston field office investigation, the closure, the Graves-Mote relationship, and the Radner disappearance. It was careful and specific, and cited every document they had access to, and it was also necessarily incomplete because the full shape of it was still becoming visible. She sent it at 12:40 a.m. and then sat back in her chair and let herself feel the specific exhaustion of having done the thing she needed to do, which was different from and heavier than the exhaustion of just being tired. Diane said, "You too in a minute." Simone stood up. She stopped at the kitchen doorway and looked at her sister, who had already turned back to her screen. Diane. Her sister looked up. You didn't have to come last night. You had 2 hours of driving and a case you were in the middle of, and Mama, and you came anyway. Diane's expression did something brief and complicated. You called me from a police station, I know. You're my sister. I know that too. Simone looked at her. Thank you. Diane made a small sound that was the compressed version of everything she might have said if she were the kind of person who said those things out loud. She turned back to her screen. Simone went to bed. She slept for 6 hours, which was more than she'd expected and less than she needed, and she woke at 7 to her phone, showing 4 missed calls from Grimes and a text that said, "Call me when you're up." It moved overnight. She called him before she got out of bed. Radner surfaced. Grimes said. His voice had the quality of someone who had been awake for a portion of the night and was running on professional momentum. He called his former supervisor at the public defender's office at 2 a.m. Athens, we had a monitor on that line as of 9 p.m. yesterday. He was scared you could hear it. He said someone had told him to leave, told him there was going to be an investigation and his name would come up, and he'd gone to stay with his brother in Laredo. I. Who told him to leave? He wouldn't say the name on the call. But he said is enough. He said the person who warned him was, and I'm quoting, connected to the federal process around the prior complaint. Ives. Or someone in Graves's chain. Has Radner been contacted directly? An agent from the San Antonio office drove to Laredo at 5 this morning. Radner is talking. He has been talking for the last 2 hours. Grimes paused, and in the pause she could hear him choosing which thing to say first. He confirms that in 2019 he received a call from a senior attorney in the DA's office, not Moat directly, a deputy named Whitfield, telling him that the Webb case needed to resolve with a plea. He was told the evidence was solid. He was not told about the fabrication concerns that Luttrell's own incident report apparently flagged internally and then had redacted. Luttrell's own report flagged the evidence. There's a version of the incident report in Callahan's documents that has 2 paragraphs about the chain of custody of the evidence that don't appear in the version filed with the court. Those paragraphs raise questions about where the contraband was found and how it was logged. Someone removed them before the court filing Fuqua. We're establishing that. But yes, the metadata on the document alterations points to a terminal registered to the chief's office. 5. She was out of bed now, standing at the window of the guest room with the morning coming in at an angle across the floor. 5. The yard looked different in the morningless heat haze. The tomato plant her mother had neglected, casting a small shadow on the concrete. Times, she said. Radner. Can you flip him? Already done. Nice. He signed a cooperation agreement at 6:40 a.m. A cooperation in exchange for immunity on the 2019 matter, given that he was acting on incomplete information provided by the DA's office. A pause. Cooperation gives us the corroboration we needed on the conspiracy charges. Nice. She exhaled, not dramatically, just a breath that had been waiting to leave. Arrests, she said. Moat is being picked up this morning. His attorney was notified at 7. Fuqua will be arrested at his home agents en route. Decker and Price are already in federal custody. Their administrative suspensions were converted to holding status last night after Judge Marsh's ruling. Another pause. 9. Burton Graves has been placed on administrative leave pending the OIG referral. And you got the referral? I got a copy of yours at 1 a.m. Yes, and filed a parallel referral through my office channels. At 2, his voice was measured, but there was something underneath it, a quality of weight that had been carried and was now being redistributed. You were right that it goes further than Harwick. We're going to be in this for a while. I know, you don't have to be personally in it, he said. You've done more than be in it, she said. I'll be in it until it's finished. After she hung up, she stood at the window for another minute. The morning was doing what mornings did, regardless of what was happening in any individual life proceeding, brightening, the birds continuing their specific business. She thought about the gap between the law's speed and the situation's speed, which she'd been thinking about the night before, and she adjusted the thought. The law was slow, but it was also patient in a way that individual corruption was not. Option. Required maintenance, required active suppression, active warning, active movement of files at 6:47 in the morning. It could wait, because it didn't need to protect itself the way the thing it was pursuing did. Asymmetry, she'd come to believe, was the thing that made it possible to keep doing this work. Not certainty of outcomes, not the guarantee that things would resolve. Just the recognition that systems built on concealment were always in the end working harder than systems built on evidence. She got dressed, went to make coffee, found her mother already awake in the kitchen, managing the percolator herself with careful, deliberate movements that were clearly costing her more than she was going to admit. I've got it, Simone said. I know you do. I'm doing it anyway. Her mother do it. Stood nearby in case, but didn't intervene. Dolores Reeves managed the percolator with the same quality. She managed everything, the precise allocation of effort, the refusal to perform limitation any further than the limitation actually required. Tests. This morning, Simone said her mother didn't turn around. All of them. The main ones, there are more threads. Take time. The percolator gurgled the young man. Marcus. His attorney was briefed last night. The civil suit is going to move alongside the criminal charges. That's not what I asked. Simone looked at the back of her mother's head. Aye. His mother is with him. Her mother nodded once. Aye. Good. She turned from the percolator and looked at Simone with an expression that had many things in it. Satisfaction, yes, but also something that wasn't uncomplicated. Like Fuqua, she said. They don't think of it as harm. That's the thing. They think of it as order. They're maintaining order. She shook her head slightly. I've worked in hospitals for 34 years. I've seen that kind of thinking. It's the most dangerous kind, because the person doing the harm believes completely that they're doing necessary work. I know. It doesn't make you less angry, her mother said. Heck, it makes you more careful. Simone looked at her. Yes, that's exactly what it does. Alan Moat was arrested at his home in Harwich at 9:17 a.m. He came out the front door in a suit jacket he'd apparently put on before the agents arrived, which was either dignity or force of habit or some combination of both. And he walked to the federal vehicle with his attorney beside him, and his expression locked into the specific blankness of a man who has decided that controlling his face is the last thing he controls. His neighbor, who lived across the street and had seen the federal vehicles, filmed it on her phone. The footage was circulating by 9:45. Fuqua was arrested 20 minutes later at his home on the east side of Harwich. Answered the door. And the agents were professional, and the arrest itself was procedural and undramatic, which was how most arrests actually worked, regardless of how much the arrested person had done to deserve them. He did not come out in a suit. He came out in a button-down shirt he hadn't tucked in, and whatever he'd looked like at the press conference, podium arranged certain the posture of someone who had never needed to account for himself, was gone. What was left was a man of 58, being walked to a federal vehicle on a residential street, in a town he'd policed for 9 years, and the contrast between those two versions of him was its own form of verdict. Simone wasn't there either arrest. She was at her mother's house watching the coverage on a laptop with Diane when the Moat footage came through, and at her mother's kitchen table when OC sent her a photo from outside the Fuqua residence. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel, which was the particular sharp satisfaction of a case closing. What she felt was more complicated and lower grade. Not disappointment exactly, but the recognition that consequences when they arrived were never as final as the buildup made them feel. Life would go through the legal process. What would have attorneys and delays and all the procedural machinery that existed for everyone, including people who had spent years weaponizing that same machinery against others. Marcus Webb would have his civil suit and his cooperation testimony and a public record that said what had happened to him at 19. But the 8 months were still the 8 months. The acknowledgement didn't undo them. None of that meant the consequences were insufficient. It meant they were real, subject to the same friction and incompleteness as everything real. She was still thinking about that when her phone rang, and it was a number she didn't recognize, area code she didn't immediately place. Agent Reeves. A man's voice, younger, careful. My name is Marcus Webb. I got your number from Agent OC. She said it was okay to call. Lyons straightened in her chair. Mr. Webb. Yes, of course. A pause. She could hear him breathing, collecting something. I saw the news this morning. About Moat, about Fuqua. Another pause. I've been trying to figure out what to say for the last hour, and I can't find the right. He stopped. Uttered again. 7 years ago, when the case closed and I took the deal, my mother told me that one day someone would find it. She said that I didn't believe her. His voice was steady, but only just. I was 26 years old, and I'd spent 8 months in a federal facility for something I didn't do, and I'd lost my scholarship, and I'd lost. He stopped again. I just wanted to say thank you to you specifically. You did. And for OC told me you asked about me. Personally, before any of this got to where it is. Simon looked at the kitchen window. The light was doing what August morning light did, coming in flat and warm and indifferent to everything it was illuminating. Webb, she said. What happened to you should not have happened. Not the arrest, not the plea, not the 8 months. Not any of it. She paused. I want you to know that the cooperation you've given this investigation has made the difference between a strong case and an airtight one. You did. Took something I was scared, he said directly. I. I want to be honest about that. I was scared the whole time. I. No, she let that sit for a second. That's not the same as not doing it. Pause. Then my mother wants to know if she can send you something. Take a card. Or she does that she sends people things. Want me to ask. Tell her. Yes. Like after they hung up. She sat at the table and looked at the kitchen. Her mother had cooked in for 30 years and thought about what Marcus Webb's mother had told her son when he was 26 and depleted and past the point of believing things would resolve. One day, someone will find it. She hadn't said everything will be fine. She hadn't said the system works. She'd said someone will find it, acknowledging that the finding required a person and that the person might not come quickly, but that the was possible if someone was willing to look. That was not comfort. It was something harder than comfort. Comfort was passive. That somewhere in the apparatus, someone would choose to look rather than look away. Simone had spent 14 years choosing to look. She didn't think of it that way usually because the frame was too large to carry consciously and still do the daily work. She just did the next thing, the transmission at pump 7. The 40 minutes of calculated silence, the call to Grimes about Callahan. IG referral at 12:40 a.m. Small and procedural from the inside. Each one part of the shape that was now. This morning. Producing arrests and cooperation agreements and a public record that would stand. 3 days later, the Civil Rights Division issued a formal statement. It named all 5 individuals Luttrell, Decris, Fuqua, and Moat, and outlined the charges: civil rights violations, abuse of authority, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to deprive individuals of civil rights under color of law. Fuqua and Moat faced additional charges related to the 2019 Webb case. The statement acknowledged the prior investigation that had been inadequately followed and noted that an internal review of that closure was underway, which was the careful federal language for what Simone and Grimes both understood to be the Graves investigation. I did not name Simone, a title or position at her request. She hadn't wanted the statement to be about her. What had happened to her at Pump 7 was real and documented, and it was part of the case, but she was not the center of it. The center of it was the pattern 11 complaints, 20 incidents, one young man who had served 8 months, all the people who had called the tip line and all the people who hadn't because they'd learned that calling didn't help. She was the person who had been in the right place with the right device and the right capacity to sustain 40 minutes of calculated silence. She was not the point. The point was what the silence had uncovered. She did give one interview to the national outlets who had been calling her communications department, to a small independent journalist based in Austin who covered civil rights cases and who had, she discovered, written about the 2019 Webb case at the time. A piece that had received almost no attention and that had been essentially the only public documentation that the case existed before this week. His name was Joaquin Fares, and he'd been covering Harwick County for 3 years. And when she called his number, he picked up immediately and said, "I've been waiting for someone to call me." And she said, "I know." That read the 2019 piece. They talked for an hour. She told him what she could tell him and told him clearly what she couldn't. And she made sure the conversation included Marcus Webb's name, his mother's name. The 18 years Vera Callahan had spent inside a department, trying to do the right thing through the available channels before the available channels ran out. The interview ran 4 days after the arrests. It was long and specific, and it didn't have a triumphant arc. It had a complicated one, which Fares understood was more accurate, and Simone appreciated that he understood that. He didn't call her a hero. He called her an agent who did her job under conditions that made doing her job more difficult than it should have been, which was the truth, and which gave considerably more credit to the difficulty than most coverage of the case had managed. She sent him a text after it published that said, "Good work. You too, stay at it." The hearing was 6 weeks later. Federal District Court, Dallas. Simone sat in the gallery because she was not the attorney recurred and did not need to be at the table. And she watched the initial appearance of Harlan Mote and Wendell Fuqua in a courtroom where neither of them was the authority, where neither of them could arrange the room to their benefit, where the procedural machinery they had spent years working in their favor was now being operated by someone else. Fuqua looked smaller. That wasn't metaphor. He actually appeared physically reduced, the posture that had carried him through 30 years of being unchallenged, having lost some structural support. He didn't look at the gallery Mote did once, and she met his gaze directly and held it until he looked away. The charges were read aloud. They took a while to read because there were many of them, and each one had to be said precisely, and the reading of them in a formal court record was its own form of document permanent public entered into the system that Fuqua and Mote had believed was entirely theirs. Marcus Webb was in the gallery. He was seated 3 rows ahead of Simone, and she could see the back of his head and his mother's hand on his arm. He didn't move when the charges were read, he just sat. Afterward, in the courthouse hallway, he found her. He was taller than she'd expected from his voice on the phone, 26, with his mother's same quality of contained composure, something that had probably been learned and was now structural. He put his hand out, and this isn't over, she said. The trial process, I know, he said. The attorney explained everything. He paused. I'm not waiting for it to be over to decide how I feel about today. I looked at him. Today is today, he said. That's enough. His mother, who had been standing slightly back, stepped forward. In her 60s, with her son's same eyes, and a blazer that had the specific quality of something worn for occasions that matter. She reached out and took Simone's hand in both of hers and didn't say anything for a moment, and Simone let the silence be what it was. It turned out, Marcus's mother said finally. No, Simone said they didn't. Vera Callahan resigned from the Harwick Police Department before the month was out, under pressure. She'd been offered a position in the federal oversight body, appointed to manage the department's court-ordered restructuring, and she took it, which meant she went from the inside of a system that had spent 18 years ignoring her to the outside of it with the authority to require it to change. That was not a straight line to justice. It was a complicated sideways step that came with its own set of institutional frustrations and limitations, and she knew that going in. Called Simone the day she accepted the new position. 18 years, she said. I want to be angry that it took this long. You're allowed to be both, Simone said, angry that it took this long and glad that it happened. Not what you do. Simone thought about Pump 7, about the zip tie, about the word routine said in front of cameras, about the text that had arrived on a gas station, lot saying he knows you're here, and the long night that had followed, and the OIG referral sent at 12:40 a.m., Marcus Webb saying I was scared the whole time in a voice that was honest about the thing it was carrying. Yes, she said, that's what I do. Anne went back to her courtroom. She carried with her a revised understanding of several things, the specific ways that recusal standards could be used as tools of protection, the importance of establishing prior professional relationships in the judicial appointment process, and the look on Fuqua's face when he'd understood what room he was in. She didn't write a formal paper about it. She changed 2 things about how she ran her courtroom procedural things, small, specific, that would over time produce different outcomes in cases that would never know they were connected to a gas station stop in Harwick. That was how systemic change mostly worked, not dramatically, in increments that didn't announce themselves. Their mother recovered fully by October. The hip healed ahead of the surgical timeline, which she attributed to the blood oranges and the Tupelo honey and the stubbornness that Simone had always understood was not a character flaw, but a survival mechanism with deep roots. She went back to her garden, staked the tomato plants, back the rosemary. She watched the coverage of the Harwick case with the television at a reasonable volume and her reading glasses on her nose, and the specific expression of a woman who had raised 2 daughters to stand up in rooms that tried to make them sit down. She did not say much about it. She didn't need to. The trial process was long. It always was. Attorneys filed motions and continuances. Moat's team pursued every available avenue of delay, the federal system which could not be hurried. Regardless of the clarity of the evidence or the weight of the public word moved at the speed it moved, which was slow and was not satisfying from the outside, but was ultimately what made its judgments durable. Simone was not around for most of it. She was back in Dallas working. That was the thing about this kind of case. You gave it everything for a defined window of time, and then you went back to life, because the work did not pause for the resolution of any individual case, and the people calling the tip lines and activating transmitters and waiting for someone to find it didn't stop needing someone to find it just because the cameras had moved on. She was on a different case entirely when Grimes called her 14 months later with the verdicts. Guilty on all counts: civil rights violations, abuse of authority, conspiracy. Sentenced to 9 years. Decker and Price guilty on civil rights violations and abuse of authority, 4 years and 3 years respectively. Fuqua guilty on conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and multiple rights violation counts related to the systemic complaint suppression and the Webb case. Years. Moat guilty on conspiracy and civil rights violations. 8 years. The Graves investigation had produced a separate proceeding, internal federal disciplinary process that had resulted in forced retirement, which was not the same as criminal consequence, and which everyone involved knew was not the same as criminal consequence. And that was an unsatisfying piece that Simone filed in the folder she kept for things that were real and insufficient simultaneously. She sat in her car in a parking lot in Dallas, different city, different case, different parking lot, and listened to Grimes read the verdicts, and she said very little because there was very little to say. Civil settlement finalized last week, Grimes said. I thought you'd want to know how is he. His attorney says he's good. He started a community legal clinic in his neighborhood 3 months ago. No intake, primarily focused on unlawful detentions cases. A pause. He named it after his mother. Simone looked out the windshield at the ordinary afternoon of a Dallas parking lot. Grimes, she said. Yeah, good work you started it, he said. I pressed a button at a gas pump, she said. That's not the same. He said. That's exactly what it is. I hung up. She sat for another minute. She thought about the distance between pressing a button and 9 years of criminal charges. All the procedural miles in between, all the people who had traveled those miles. Callahan with her 18 years of dismissed reports. With his 7 years of waiting fares, with his 2019 article that nobody had read. The teenager with the red sneakers who had been right about the law and wrong to trust that being right would be enough, but who had aimed her backup phone and held steady anyway. No single person had done this. That was the thing about accountability. It wasn't a hero story, however much it got framed that way afterward. It was a distributed thing accumulated from a dozen decisions made by people who were scared or uncertain or working with partial information, who did the next available thing, because the next available thing was what you had. She had pressed a button. Callahan had kept copies. Had answered the phone at 2 a.m. The teenager had held the camera steady. Every one of those decisions had been necessary. None of them had been sufficient alone. She started the car. She had a case to get back to. There was a woman in Fort Worth who had filed a complaint 8 months ago about a pattern of conduct at a county facility, and the complaint had been reviewed and closed without follow-up. Since Simone had read the file the previous week and had identified 3 things in it that warranted a closer look. She pulled out of the parking lot and onto the street. There was always a closer look. There was always the next file, the next transmission, the next person who had been waiting for someone to choose to look, rather than look away. The work was not satisfying in the way that resolution stories made it look, because it did not end. It accumulated. It produced verdicts, and then produced the next case and the next. And the doing of it was not noble in any way that felt clean. It was difficult and political and sometimes infuriating, and occasionally it required you to stand zip-tied to a car hood in a gas station parking lot in August and calculate that the most powerful thing you could do was stay completely still. The stillness was not passivity. That was the thing that people misunderstood when they watched it from outside. The stillness was a form of intention. The silence was a form of action. The patience was a form of pressure applied in the direction of truth, sustained beyond the point where most people would have moved. Sometimes. Not always, not cleanly, not without cost, it was enough. Times. Simone Reeves drove north on I-35 toward a woman in Fort Worth who needed someone to look closely at her file, and the afternoon moved around her and she drove.